Okay, I'm going to start with something a little different. No PowerPoint. So I'm not going to anesthetize your brain or my brain with PowerPoint, but I am going to ask you to use your imaginations. My theme of emergence is to do with world history. If you want to see that in another way, it's about the design of humankind as a whole. It's a very top-down view. It's a prediction. We've already heard warnings about predictions here today, and those warnings are all good. So this is other things being equal prediction. If the sea level rises by 2 meters, or we're hit by an asteroid, or the singularity happens sometime in the next 20 years, all of these bets are off. Okay? So I want you to start by bringing up in front of your imaginations a world map, your best edition of the world map. I want you then to visualize on that map what you know about world history. This will probably vary quite a bit from next to nothing to islands of knowledge here and there, world history tending to be taught in an archipelagic way. And then I want you to take a very high altitude perspective on this. So I hope nobody suffers from altitude sickness. I want you to be sitting up there looking down on all of this from a very great height. Because what I want to do is to try to reset how you think about where you are in world history. And my basic argument goes like this, that in the 19th century, something which most of us don't think too much about, there was a transformational change got underway in the human condition. Right? We are still living very much downstream from that transformational change. This means that you were born into it, your parents were born into it, your grandparents were born into it, and probably your great-grandparents were born into it. So it is normalized. Right? It's the way we think the world is. But the point I want to make is that it's not normal. We have been living in a transitional period, and that transitional period is now, I'm going to argue, coming to an end. Right? So we're going to be moving into a new norm, as it were, and I'm going to try and sketch that out for you. In order to see this, you need to be able to stand outside it. Okay? We're all inside it at the moment. So as I say, it seems normal. It seems like the way history has always been, but it's not. So I'm going to start by telling you probably a little bit more than you want to know about the 19th century. And then I'm going to look very briefly at the 20th century, and then I'm going to make a few prognostications about where this might be headed once this transition period is over. Okay, the 19th century. There was a great transformation in the 19th century of a kind that doesn't happen very often in human history. If you want to think in old-fashioned Marxist terms, you might want to think of this as a revolution in the mode of production. That's only happened once before, about 12,000 years ago, when we moved from a hunter-gathering form of production to an agricultural or agrarian form of production. In the 19th century, we moved to an industrial form of production. And this changed pretty much everything about the human condition. Or if not quite everything, at least it changed pretty much all of the big picture things. A revolution or a transformation in the mode of production releases huge amounts of new resources into the international system, and it tends to stimulate big population growth. Those of you who like looking at graphs will notice that all of the graphs from population to CO2 in the atmosphere mysteriously begin in the 19th century and then go vertical. Right? So what is it about the 19th century? Well, most of you will have some sense of the Industrial Revolution and the rise of capitalism and the move away from older forms of production. You may, and we're still in that stream. That goes on and on and on and seems to be pretty much endless. What you may be a bit less sensitive to is that the whole framework of political and social ideas in which we live also got rolling at that time. So things like liberalism, 19th century, nationalism and its ugly twin racism, or scientific racism in particular, 19th century. The whole idea of progress basically hinges from the 19th century. So does socialism, counterpoint to liberalism and capitalism. These ideas all got rolling in the 19th century and have been working themselves out ever since in the context of industrial modernity. They displaced a bunch of older ideas that we had organized ourselves around for a very long time previously. They replaced dynasticism and absolutism as a way of organizing our politics. They broadly replaced mercantilism as a way of organizing our economy. They, much more slowly and much more painfully, they replaced the idea of human inequality, that idea which underpinned slavery, imperialism, racism. These things basically were corrosive in the longer run of that. So we've moved to the idea that all people are equal. That's a pretty radical idea, and it didn't really come into being until the end of the Second World War. Also in the 19th century, all kinds of new entities were invented, entities that we take for granted now, which populate, as it were, our world. The nation state. The state had been around for a long time, but the nation state, as we understand it, is a 19th century invention. The intergovernmental organization, that which you think of as the UN and the WTO and all of those sorts of things, they all began in the 19th century. Global civil society, organized non-state entities, international non-governmental organizations, these kinds of things really got rolling in the 19th century, the anti-slavery movement being an early example. Even the modern corporation, which you either love or hate, was born in the 19th century with the British Companies Act. Now the thing was that this revolution in the 19th century happened amazingly unequally. Right? It generated gigantic amounts of power and it concentrated them in a very small number of places. And we've lived in that world in which power has been concentrated in a small number of places ever since. And this is all kinds of power, right? It's to do with military power, it's to do with wealth and economic power, it's to do with the power of ideas, it's to do with social power, all of these things. In all of these areas, in the 19th century, huge inequalities were created. So we moved into a world that is conventionally defined as being a kind of center-periphery world. There's a core where all of the power and wealth and ideas are, and then there's a periphery which tends to be poor and exploited and often rebellious and isn't developing fast enough. You've all seen the kind of labelings of advanced industrial countries and developing countries or less developed countries or various other ways of talking about this. This has been the normal world since this uneven revolution of the 19th century. It concentrated in a very small number of countries, this one where we're sitting, first of all. So by 1850 or so, Britain was responsible for half of the world's industrial production. Think of that. I mean, this tiny little place, half of the world's industrial production. That's how concentrated it was. Slowly but fairly surely, a small number of other countries got hold of this package of modernity and learned how to cope with it and gained the sort of power and wealth that went with it. So France and Germany and the US weren't very far behind Britain, so they're all coming up by the late 19th century. Japan, interestingly, the only non-Western country to get this, to actually quickly learn the package of modernity and also become a great power. Russia more slowly, but we're still talking about a very small number of countries which dominated the world very impressively in the 19th century and for most of the 20th century as well. So this revolution was concentrated and incredibly powerful and produced huge inequalities. Now, let's move on to the 20th century. In the 20th century, this small group of countries that have got hold of the revolutions of modernity try and work out how to take it forward. That's a rather polite way of putting it. The less polite way of putting it is they fight 3 world wars over how to work this out. Okay? So we've got this core periphery system dominated by a small number of big powers, industrial powers, and they fight amongst themselves over a whole bunch of things and work out some aspects of this new condition in which they're in. Okay? They work out that fascism isn't a runner. Right? Fascism takes 2 of the 19th century ideas, nationalism and racism, and combines them in a particularly intense way. And this is so unpleasant and so unneighborly that everybody else has to fight it into extinction, which is what they do in the Second World War. They also begin to figure out that this new mode of power, this industrial mode of power, is actually bigger than the states that have given rise to it. So by the middle of the 20th century, it's pretty clear that fear of war is beginning to rival fear of defeat, which is a rather new thing in the human condition, because it's becoming clear that if you go on fighting wars like this, nobody's going to win. It's just a question of whose rubble bounces last. We also move into a world in which increasingly you've got a very intense global economy. Most of you are probably familiar with some of the literature on globalization and will know much about this. So there's an ongoing problem about how to manage this. Everybody depends on it more and more and more, but it's intrinsically unstable. It has financial and industrial cycles which are very different from the agrarian cycles which preceded it. So that becomes more and more of an obsessive central problem in the world. We also find that a couple of the older ideas, as I've mentioned before, die out. Empire basically dies out. You can't do empire under these conditions, and things like slavery and racism and the other elements of formal human inequality also die out. Now, what we've got now, where the situation we're in now to bring us up to the present, is perhaps captured by Fareed Zakaria's nice phrase about the rise of the rest. What does that mean? It tends to be talked about in relation to China, the rise of China and all that, and India, and more broadly the BRICS and others. But if you step back a little bit and think about what this means, it means that this revolution of modernity, which started off being so concentrated, is now beginning to spread more and more widely. So the core, as it were, is getting bigger, and the periphery is getting smaller. There are still some places in the world that have not figured out how to come to terms with modernity, and therefore not accessed the power and the wealth that it generates, as well as all of the other problems that it generates, of course. But more and more peoples have started to figure this out. So we're in a situation now where this revolution of modernity that started out so concentrated is becoming global, in the sense, at least, that the majority of people are coming to terms with it in one way or another and beginning to both reap its benefits and to encounter its problems. So it's diffusing steadily and steadily, and that we're therefore moving away from this position of great inequality that we were in. So, what kind of world does this point us towards? If we assume that this diffusion is going to continue, and I think that's, other things being equal, a pretty good bet. What does it say? Just 4 kinds of ideas for you to take away and think about in relation to this. The first idea is that we're going to move away from this very unequal distribution of power that has framed the world we live in for the last 2 centuries. There will be no more superpowers. Any of you who've studied world politics may have noticed that at the beginning of the 20th century, running up to the First World War, there were about 9 great powers. Right? By the time we get to the end of the Second World War, there are 2 superpowers. Right? By the time we get to the end of the Cold War, there's 1 superpower. Right? This seems to me to be a secular trend which is heading very firmly towards 0, right? Because the ability to concentrate power sufficiently to have a world dominated by a small number of states was based on the idea of the unequal distribution of this revolution of modernity. And that revolution is now becoming more widespread. So nobody is going to be able to concentrate sufficient resources to be able to play the superpower role anymore. We're going to be living in a world which looks, in terms of the distribution of power, more like the ancient and classical world. Lots of relatively evenly powered entities in the system. You can see the United States losing its grip as we sit here. It's the last superpower. It's trying desperately to hang on, and it is doomed to fail in your lifetimes, if not mine. So we're moving towards a more decentered world. A lot of people will throw at you the analogy of the 1930s and say, woo, the last time we had this kind of thing, it was disaster and world wars and such like. I don't believe this. I don't think there are going to be great power wars anymore. The conditions for the 1930s are completely different from now. In the 1930s, it was legitimate to be racist. It was legitimate to build empires. There were rival ideologies all over the place, and mercantilism was by and large the dominant economic ideology. None of that applies now. Racism is more or less out of fashion. Empire building is very much out of fashion. Everybody understands that the world economy has to be kept ticking over in one form or another, and everybody is scared to death of nuclear weapons and the fact that you can't win wars fought with nuclear weapons. I'm not saying all is peace and love and harmony, but I'm saying there won't be any more world wars in this system because the reasons for fighting them are no longer there. So don't let people scare you with the analogy of the 1930s. That's the second point. The third point is that we're all capitalists now. Okay? So those big ideological wars over how to organize the political economy of humankind that dominated the 20th century are over. Capitalism won. It's whether you like it or not, it's the only way you can generate huge amounts of power and wealth. And the generation of huge amounts of power and wealth is still very attractive. Everybody is now in this game, and there are different types of capitalism that are unfolding, and we'll be living in a world of experimental capitalisms. The Americans will stay with their kind of ultra-liberal capitalism. The Europeans will probably try and stay with their kind of social market capitalism. The Chinese and the Russians are going to explore more authoritarian modes of capitalism. What the Indians and the Brazilians and others are going to do, I don't know, but they're all going to come up with their own particular takes on this way of organizing a political economy. And that's fine. That's a good thing. Let 100 flowers bloom inside the capitalist world. Most of these things are therefore good. There's one, I think, dark side to this. I'm going to end on a dark side note, sorry. But it, I think, relates a little bit to some of what others have said here. And this is a problem. I've no solution to this problem, but it's a very clear problem to see, which is that one of the consequences of modernity and industrial power and the unleashing of science and education and all that is that the ability to wreak large amounts of destruction has become much more diffuse than it used to be. If you wanted to really wreck something on a large scale in the good old days, you had to build up a big army, a big state. You needed lots and lots of resources and organizations. Now, however, even individuals can command quite considerable powers of destruction, and small groups can do so as well. I'm not just thinking of nuclear weapons, but I'm also thinking of viruses of various sorts. We are therefore living in a world in which access to significant means of destruction is getting easier and easier and easier for smaller and smaller groups of people. This, it seems to me, changes the political equation in significant ways. It's a challenge for all kinds of states. It's a challenge for democracies. We can see already some failures to meet that challenge in the so-called war on terror. It's also a challenge for more authoritarian states. And it's a challenge both domestically and globally. Uncivil global society is out there as well as global civil society. So this, it seems to me, is a political problem which is going to require a lot of very fresh and innovative thinking. And so I hope the speakers that have preceded me and said that there's emergent forms of new thinking to deal with these new problems can turn some of that emerging capacity towards this problem, because there isn't yet, it seems to me, a clear way of defining a new form of politics which has to operate against the background of the fact that the capacity to inflict violence is becoming more widespread. Thank you for listening.